So let's have a look at the physical occlusion of pits and fissures. So physically filling in, not to be confused with a filling, but occluding the fissure with a material. There are two materials that are commonly used at the moment in dentistry to perform sealants, dental sealants, pedal fissure sealants. And you'll see these names come up again later because they are also the material. A form of these materials is used for filling teeth, so for placing inside cavities to do dental fillings or restorations. But the materials behave in a particular way. They're adhesive. We call them adhesive materials because they stick to tooth tissues that make them very useful for both sealants and for dental restoration materials. I'm going to talk about them today just in terms of their application for fissure sealants. So the two types are resin composites and glass ionomer cement, or commonly called GIC, glass ionomer cement. Resin composites are commonly called composite resin, but it's actually more correct to say resin composite. Let's look first at the resin composites. Now, these are materials which, as the name suggests, are a composite of materials that are held together with a resin. So I'm not sure what this is, but this might be a cake or something, or a biscuit or a slice, a hedgehog maybe, I don't know what it is, or it might be styrofoam. But you can see, I'm just sort of demonstrating the way these materials work. So there are these these little fillers here, little chunks of material that are then held together by a glue or a resin. So when the whole thing sets together, you get a relatively strong composite material. And just to simplify that a little bit further, you can see here that it's made up of what we call inorganic filler. So these little particles here, little chunks, little solid pieces of the filler are suspended in a resin matrix. So the area surrounding these little shapes is representing that resin. And before it is set or polymerized, the material is malleable. So it will flow like a thick custard if it's a fissure sealant material, or if you're using it as a restorative material, it will come as relatively viscous or thick. It'll be malleable, but it will be much thicker than the form in which we use it for fissure sealants. Now the key here for this material is that it will not harden or set until it is polymerized. So there is a polymerization process which is activated once the material is placed on the tooth. And that polymerization, most commonly in most resin composites these days, is done with a light. So there will be a particular spectrum of light that will activate a lot of free radicals that will cause the hardening or the polymerization of the material. There are some resin composites that as soon as you add the organic filler, so they come as a separate powder and a liquid, which is then mixed together. Now once that mixing commences, the polymerization reaction or chemical reaction starts, and they will set automatically without the light. The light cured, so that's what we call it, light cured resin composites will set when we want them to, when we expose them to light. However, having said that, if you leave these resin composites, these command cure, light cured resin composites in natural light, they will slowly start to set. So you can't muck around with them, you need to place them and then use the light to cure them. So some fun facts about resin composites. They can be filled or unfilled. We'll talk about that in a moment. The materials are fluid, as I said, and then they set hard after we cure them. So there's the light curing, light polymerization, or auto-cured through a chemical reaction. So as soon as the powder and the liquid are mixed together, they then start to cure. All right. You may come across some of these in clinical dentistry, but mostly these days we'll use light cured or light polymerized resin composites. The fluid resin allows flow. Okay, so we want the resin to flow into the pits and fissures, to flow along the pits and fissures, and we want them to flow down as far as possible into the base of the pits and fissures. So we want resin composites used in fissure sealants to be relatively fluid. So the flow, that is its flowability, is related to the amount of filler. So the more filler you have, the thicker the material is, right? It's like adding flour to water. The more you put in and stir, the thicker the solution gets until eventually it'll turn into dough. But if you put a very little amount of flour in, you'll get a relatively watery, flowable material. So it's the same concept with resin composites. So the less fill they have, the more flowable they are. All right? So in fissure sealants, you would expect there'd be less fill to allow them to flow into pits and fissures. So we use unfilled composites for that high flow, all right, for resin sealants. So what that means, though, is because we're reducing the filler in the material, we're actually making the material less strong, less able to withstand compressive forces. All right. So what this means is that we need to ensure that the fissure sealant is in the fissure, pit or fissure only. It's not sitting on the pointy bits or the cusps of the tooth, because if it is, the tooth above it will come together and crack it off because it won't be very strong. Okay, so it's important when you're placing resin composite fissure sealants that you ensure that you don't overfill the pits and fissures. Otherwise, they will come into contact with the tooth above it when the person bites together, and they will fracture off. But we don't actually need the bulk of strength to protect the fissure. All we need to do is block off the entrance to the fissure to stop the sugars and plaque from getting into the fissures. So we don't actually need that strength. All right. So if they're placed appropriately, this low viscosity or low filler is not an issue. The other thing that's interesting to note, and we know this from scientific clinical studies, is that we don't actually need the fissure sealant to flow all the way into the base, right down to the bottom of that fissure. All we need for it to do is to block off the top. Okay? So the seal is the deal. And it, just as an analogy to think about how that works, if you've got a bottle, an empty bottle, just placing a top over the opening to the bottle will prevent anything from getting into it. You don't actually have to fill the whole bottle up with concrete in order to stop anything getting into the bottle. All right? So as long as you're sealing up the entrance, if you're sealing it well, nothing can then penetrate into the base of the fissures. So with fissure sealants, the seal is the deal. Okay? Now here's a really nice picture of a tooth that has had a fissure sealant placed and has been then cut in half so that you can see the material here, resin composite, and you can see the enamel here. And you can see this one is beautifully sealing. Here's the mouth up here, sealing off the mouth from the base of that pit and fissure where the toothbrush bristle couldn't reach. So this seal here, even if it didn't actually penetrate all the way to the base, as long as it was sealed around this area here, would provide protection for this tooth. Okay, so really, even if it went to this level here, it would still be providing protection for this area here. So this is very cleansable with the toothbrush. So the materials, resins, sealants require, in order to adhere to the tooth, they actually require that we prepare the tooth surface to receive the material. And what we need to do with resin composites is, because they don't bond chemically to the tooth, GICs do, but these don't, we actually need to treat the surface of the tooth in a way that creates little locks in the enamel, little microscopic locks or micropores in the enamel that the material will flow into, and when set will lock to the tooth surface or to those micropores. Now, in order to produce the micropores, we actually need to demineralize the tooth surface, and we do that using a very, very strong concentrated acid, orthophosphoric acid. It's extremely acidic, and so don't get it on your skin, because if you get it on your skin or your clothes, it'll burn a big hole in them. All right? So it's required though, because the tooth is highly mineralized, and in order to demineralize and create little pores or locks for the resin, we actually need to use this strong concentration of fluoride. And we call that process etching the tooth. All right? So the etchant, the acid, will etch the tooth. And if you've ever seen glass that has been etched by an acid with, you know, a picture or a name on it, and you run your finger over the area that's been etched, you'll notice that it is roughened. Okay, that's what we're doing with this etch. It's extremely strong and extremely dangerous, so we'll very carefully introduce you to this material before we use it. So we etch the surface with orthophosphoric acid. The concentration of the acid is about 40%. It then creates these micropores in the enamel. And the little pores are like little locks in the enamel that the material then flows into. And a low viscosity resin can flow into these pores to about a depth of 50 to 100 microns. And then when you zap it with the light, it will set hard, and the resin inside the pores will set hard and be locked into the tooth surface. And that's what retains the resin composite. I'll give you some references to textbooks to get a more detailed description of how that works. But just for now, in a nutshell, that's how it works. Here is a picture taken with a lot of magnification of enamel that has been etched with orthophosphoric acid. So the etching has created these little areas around the enamel rods, which then allows the material to flow into it. And once it's in there, we then set it and it locks in place so it won't pull back off the surface. And here you can see another very magnified image where the resin has been placed on the tooth surface. It is then, the tooth has then been sectioned down the middle, so it's cut in half. So we can actually see here, these streaks here are actually the resin composite that has flowed down into little spaces. This is the enamel rod here. Okay, oops, knew that would happen. This is the enamel rod here, and etching has actually opened up spaces between each of those rods. The resin has just flowed into it, and then it's been set hard with the light. And you can see here is the Fisher sealant here. Here are the resin tags, and it holds or anchors it to the tooth surface. So resin composite is a really effective material for occluding fissures and pits, but it does have one significant drawback. It is extremely sensitive to moisture. So the resin composite material is what we call hydrophobic. It hates water, so it's very moisture sensitive. And if you try to place resin composite on a wet tooth surface, it will not stick. Okay? It will be compromised and it will fall off. So that's problematic when you're dealing with a human mouth, because they're full of saliva, which is a fluid. All right? So what we actually have to do is isolate the tooth surface from the saliva. and keep it dry while we're placing the resin composite. And there's lots of ways we can do that, and we'll talk about that another time. But you cannot use it in the presence of moisture. Okay? So if you cannot isolate a tooth effectively to keep it dry during the procedure, you should not use a resin composite. Because if you do, the sealant will fail and decay will then occur. We will talk about tooth isolation, and particularly rubber dam isolation, as the most effective way to keep teeth dry while we're operating them on. But just for now, keep in mind that really important critical factor, that the tooth must be kept completely dry. And here is a tooth with a rubber dam in place. Okay, so it's got a rubber coat over it, which is held in place by this clamp. Resin composites require this, otherwise the moisture present in the mouth will cause them to fail.